So, tonight's meeting, we have Dr. John Grenville, Secretary of the Derbyshire LMC, retired GP from Derby City and former expert witness in general practice. I've got a very brief resume of him. He was a GP in Derby City Centre from 81 to 2013. He joined Derbyshire LMC as a trainee member in 79 and became secretary in 1984, and he remains in post there to date until likely retirement in July, but it is retirement in July. In his early years, he was deputy police surgeon. He married a solicitor, got involved in the legal world and began writing reports for solicitors in the mid-80s. These were on children's cases and low-level criminal law. He became involved in the Shipman case and then undertook a significant amount of work for various police forces as an expert in general practice. But he likes to sum up as his portfolio career, including medical, legal and medical and political work, but regards himself quite simply as a GP. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. John Grenville.
Well, thank you, Helen, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me. Can you hear me at the back?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. 1st of August 1998, I was sitting having my cornflakes listening to Radio 4, as I usually do, and the headline was that the police in Hyde, Manchester, had earlier that morning exhumed an elderly lady because there was a suspicion that her GP had forged her will and possibly killed her. And I remember thinking to myself, oh dear, another John Bodkin Adams. Some of you, hopefully not very many of you, but some of you may remember John Bodkin Adams, who was a GP in the 1930s, 40s and early 50s in Eastbourne, who was tried in the early 50s, about 52 or 53, for the murder of several of his patients. He was acquitted. Several books have been written about him, the most recent being by a lady called Jane Robbins, who has had the advantage, I think, of being able to write her book after the revelations of Shipman. I thought no more about this until a few days later, the radio told me again that someone else had been exhumed. And then again, a few days later, there were 3 exhumations in quite quick order. And I thought to myself, well, this is going to be a problem for general practice. We just had the Bristol Heart Babies scandal, and the inquiry into that had just reported, and our hospital colleagues were concerned, they were in some disarray, they felt put upon, and I thought, if we're unfortunate here, GP's going to get the same treatment. Well, we did in spades, and I'll talk about that in a little while. A few weeks after that, I was phoned by the postgraduate dean for general practice in the Trent region, as it was then. He said to me that there was going the then health authority in what we now know as West Pennine, it was then Tameside and Blossom, were looking for someone to help with an inquiry into these 3 ladies who had been exhumed. And again, I thought to myself, well, yes, if this GP is found to have killed his patients, the health authority are going to need to do an inquiry, as health authorities did, to make sure it wasn't their fault. They hadn't missed anything. So I said, yes, I'll do that. The reason he rang me, it was very serendipitous. He had been the course organiser in Derby when I did my vocational training. He knew that I was married to a solicitor. He knew that I'd been a police surgeon. Most of all, he knew that my trainer had been Ralph Lawrence, a GP in Lebrooks on the Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire border, who had several great interests. He was a police surgeon par excellence. He was president of the Association of Police Surgeons of Great Britain in his time. He was a medical politician, again par excellence. He was chairman of the BMA's organisation committee for many years. He was a great GP, cradle-to-grave stuff, in a very deprived ex-coal mining community. So there were three things that he taught me and gave me a passion for. There was a fourth, which he wasn't able to give me a passion for, and that was intrapartum GP obstetrics. I found it a sweaty business. However, Bob Headley, the dean, knew that I might have an interest in this. The health authority at the time had been asked by the police, I didn't know this, the police had said, can you find a GP who can tell us something about what GPs do? And they said, no, too close to home, everybody knows Shipman. So they asked their region, which was then the Northwest region, who said, no, still too close to home, we'll ask the next door region. So they asked Trent, and Bob rang me. Serendipity in action. Up to that time, I'd been doing, as Helen said, a little bit of work for local solicitors. They wanted to know, here are some photographs of someone who's got an injury in the eye. He says he was punched by this bloke. Is this consistent? And also a little bit of children's work. Is this family fit to bring up this child? Basically, do they have major illnesses that make it impossible for them to bring up a child? This was my first big medico-legal case. And nothing happened for weeks, and it wasn't until the first week in December that I got a message to say, would I come to the police station in Hyde? Well, okay. All right. I wonder what's going on. So I went. A whole floor of the police station at Hyde, which is quite a big police station, had been turned into an incident room. And I was briefed. By that time, they knew they were onto something big. And they said they would like me to look through the notes of the suspicious deaths, or the possibly suspicious deaths, and give them some advice on what Shipman had done, what he should have done, what he should not have done, and whether what had happened was consistent with ordinary general practice. So I said, yes, I could do that. And they said, well, here are the first 15. And as the weeks went by, they said, here's the next 50, and here's the next 100. And it kept me busy. The trial, he was charged in fairly short order. He had to be charged because basically no one could stop him practicing unless and until he was remanded in custody. There was no mechanism for stopping him practicing. He was not removed from the medical register until after he had been convicted of 15 murders. So the trial began in October 1999. It lasted 3 months, and I was up there for the 3 months. And I thought what I might do is just tell you a little bit about the victims for whose deaths he was convicted. And it starts with Kathleen Grundy, the lady who was exhumed on the 1st of August. She was well known in Hyde. She had served 2 stints as the mayor of Hyde. She was an 81-year-old lady who was very fit and healthy and active. She ran the dinner club for the old ladies. She was meticulous. She had a daughter. Her daughter was a lawyer. The daughter specialised in probate law. She lived in Warwick. She was married to a professor of physics at Warwick University. The daughter, Angela Woodruff, was very, very surprised sometime a few weeks after her mother's death to receive a communication from a legal firm in Hyde saying, "We've got your mother's will." Because Angela thought that she had her mother's will. She had prepared it for her. It had been extant for years. It left everything to Angela and to her two sons. And Angela couldn't believe that her mother would have changed her will in favour of her GP, saying in her will that this was because she was so grateful for everything that Dr. Shipman had done for her and for the town of Hyde, and my family is not in need. And I'll show you an image of that will in a minute. I'm afraid it hasn't come up very well. But it was gross. It looked awful. Now, Kathleen Grundy had trained and worked as a secretary for many years. As I say, she was meticulous. She was a good typist. She handwrote her own letters, and she typed important documents. The will had been sent the day after she died, no, the day before she died, to this firm in Hyde. And a couple of days later, a typed letter appeared, signed by a J or S Smith, it's not clear which it is, saying, "I gather you have this will. The lady is dead." So the solicitors made inquiries. At this point, Angela Woodruff came up to Hyde with the will, which had two witnesses' signatures on it. And she hunted out one of the witnesses, and she went to see her and asked her, had she really witnessed her mother's will? And this lady said, "Well, no, I was sitting in the waiting room in my doctor's surgery, Dr. Shipman's surgery, and the doctor came out and told me and the lad who was sitting next to me that he had a patient who he was enrolling into a clinical trial, and she needed to sign that she'd been enrolled, and her signature needed witnessing." So these two, who didn't know much about the way you run clinical trials, went into the consulting room and witnessed Kathleen Grundy, who really thought, she said in her diary, that she was being enrolled into a clinical trial. It was all very exciting, and Dr. Shipman was going to come round tomorrow morning and take the first blood sample for this clinical trial. So she stayed in for him. She was found dead later in the day, sitting in her chair, fully clothed, looking peaceful. Shipman was called, and he certified death as being due to old age. Now, we can perhaps talk about old age as a cause of death a little bit later. We certainly talked about it a lot at the Shipman inquiry. So that was the first one. It was interesting that in her medical records there were 3 previous consultation records suggesting that Shipman was concerned that Kathleen Grundy was an opiate user. It is interesting that eventually the notes, some of which are handwritten and some of which are computerised, I remember only too well the transition for GPs between handwritten notes and computerised notes. And very often we kept 2 sets. Because we were told we couldn't give up using the paper notes even when we got our computers. Anyway, it was discovered that Shipman's computer system had an audit trail. And when the police looked at the audit trail, these 3 records suggesting that he was worried that she might have a heroin habit at the age of 81, as the ex-bearers of Hyde, had been made on the day after she died, were put into the record looking as if they had been made 3 years ago, 6 months ago, and a couple of weeks ago. The second lady at the trial was a lady called Bianca Pomfret. She was aged 49, so not all of Shipman's victims were elderly. Bianca had recurrent depression, and she was visited by Shipman on the 10th of December 97. On that date, he created entries which were dated and appeared in the record as 21st of April 97, 28th of April 97, and 8th of December 97. And these entries gave a clear history of a lady who was developing ischemic heart disease. She was suffering from chest pains on exertion. He didn't treat these, but they were there in the record. She was later that day found dead by a social worker who came to check up on her because of her quite severe depressive illness. So an ambulance was called, and Shipman arrived. He wrote a medical certificate of the cause of death, giving the cause of death as a coronary thrombosis, which of course was backed up by his notes. And the interesting thing about this one was that her depressive illness was so severe that she was under the care, the continuing care, of a consultant psychiatrist who gave evidence at the trial that she was so severely depressed that he was worried about the potential for suicide. He was treating her. He was worried about the potential for suicide. So here Shipman had a sudden unexpected death that no one knew anything about. She'd just been found dead. Again, sitting up, wearing her clothes, looking entirely peaceful. In a lady whose psychiatrist was concerned that she was a suicide risk. Personally, I would have reported that to the coroner. Shipman didn't. He wrote the MCCD. And so it goes on. There are 15 of these. Shipman used all sorts of ways of hiding the truth. Pretty much all of them except one, who was found lying on her bed, were found in their day clothes, sitting in chairs, looking peaceful. They were variously given death certificates of coronary thrombosis, stroke, all sorts of things. The sorts of things where, if it actually happens to you, it doesn't just, you don't just go out like a light. You feel this terrible pain in your chest, or this odd feeling in your head. You know you have an impending sense of doom. You reach for the telephone, you get up out of your chair to go for the phone. All these folk just sat there. It happened. Sometimes it happened a little quicker than that. There were at least 2 where Shipman was in the house. He was known to be in the house because other people were in the house as well. Other people being in the house would move to another room. They were visitors or friends or whatever. They'd go to another room while Shipman held his consultation with the patient. Good manners, really. Very good mannered folk in Hyde. And Shipman would then come out and ask a question, and the other person would go into the room, and oh dear, she's dead. She was alive when I came out to fetch you, but now she's dead. Very, very fast. No sense of urgency when Shipman comes out, you know. Yes, I think we're probably going to have to persuade Mrs. So-and-so that she needs to go into hospital, but she's not really very keen, so we perhaps ought to ring her daughter or something. Go back in. Oh dear, too late. There was one case where Shipman came out of the house and walked down the garden path just as a friend was coming in through the garden gate, crossed him on the path, went in, and there was the lady in the front room dead. Shipman couldn't have been gone more than 60 seconds. One lady died in the surgery. She came in. She had a chest infection. She was known to have mild chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. She'd been coughing more than usual that day, so she went in to the surgery. Shipman saw her, spent time with her. He said that he took her to the examination room because he had a separate examination room from his consulting room. He took her to the examination room. He wanted to do an ECG, but he had technical problems with the ECG machine, so it took quite a little while. And while he turned his back to fiddle with the ECG machine to try and get it to work, she died on the couch. So he tried cardiopulmonary resuscitation for 20 to 25 minutes, on his own, without alerting anybody else in the surgery, he said. Then he went and saw 3 more patients, and then he came out to reception to say, Mrs. So-and-so has died, perhaps we ought to try and get hold of her daughter. Not very many people questioned Shipman about these things as they were happening. He was well known as the best doctor in Hyde. His patients loved him. He would go the extra mile. He was one of those doctors who still went to visit his elderly patients without being asked. Oh, I was in your neighbourhood, I dropped in. Really bad news, that. But the patients who he didn't kill loved him for it. When it all broke, quite a lot of patients at the surgery set up a fighting fund for him. The place was covered with cards wishing him good luck and saying they couldn't believe it. The big legal question here was something called similar facts. All these ladies have died soon after being seen by Shipman. They were all found sitting up in their day clothes, looking perfectly peaceful. There was, for the ones who were exhumed, there was no evidence of the cause of death that Shipman had written up. Mind you, some of them had been interred some time before. Probably one of the worst jobs in the world belonged to John Rutherford, the Home Office pathologist who performed these post-mortems. But in many cases, the heart was well preserved. Some of them had been embalmed. And there was very little evidence in some of the ones of any coronary atheroma. Now, that isn't to say that they didn't die of coronary thrombosis, of an arrhythmia, but it doesn't give you a cause of death. What was found in all of them was morphine at high levels in the muscles and the liver. None of them had been prescribed morphine. Now that's not true, one of them had, but in low doses. They all had levels of morphine in their muscle and liver, which were consistent with levels that have been observed in people who are known to have died of heroin overdoses. So there was a series of 15 deaths. In normal circumstances, the law says that the jury must consider each of those deaths individually. But after several days of legal argument, it was decided that the jury could consider the similar facts evidence. These were all very strange. Each one on its own might not convince the jury beyond reasonable doubt that something had gone wrong. But take them all together and it makes it much harder for the jury to say, well, maybe there's an excuse, maybe there's a possibility. And that reasoning was continued following the trial. 15 charges, 15 convictions, 15 life sentences, and a recommendation that he never be released. There was a series of 27 inquests held by the South Manchester coroner, which I attended, which again relied on similar fact evidence. Again, another 27 people who had died sitting in their day clothes, looking peaceful, just after Shipman had seen them, or while he was seeing them. Then Dame Janet came along with the Shipman inquiry and found another a total of 250 similar facts cases, stretching all the way back to Shipman's early days as a GP when he practiced in Todmorden, where he developed a pethidine habit, and when it was discovered, he was using 700 to 800 milligrams of pethidine a day intravenously. He said he was very sorry. He said he wouldn't do it again. He admitted to 7 specimen charges before the magistrates and asked for another 78 to be taken into account. He was fined and ordered to pay the then family practitioner committee compensation for the pethidine that he'd swindled them out of by prescribing it for other people. He was referred to a psychiatrist who looked after him as an inpatient at a retreat in York, and said eventually that he'd given up his habit, he would be okay now. The GMC read that report and decided to take no further action, but did warn Shipman that it would lie on file, and if anything like this ever happened again, they would consider this incident as well as anything that happened in the future. Well, he took good care. I don't think he did continue his habit. I don't think he could have done, because I don't think he could have done the things he did if he was as high as a kite. But he had learned how you siphon controlled drugs off from the system. And one of the interesting things is the amount of diamorphine that it can be shown that Shipman prescribed or requisitioned, mostly from the same pharmacy next door to his surgery in Hyde. The unaccounted diamorphine is 32,000 milligrams. That's an awful lot of morphine. It's enough to kill a herd of elephants, let alone people, especially frail elderly. Shipman is the only person I know who has probably seen a 100 milligram vial of diamorphine. They are produced, I don't know why, and there is a 500 milligram vial of diamorphine, and I've never seen one of those either. Shipman saw quite a lot of them. He ordered them. The pharmacist said, well, yes, he was a high user of opiates, but then he had a very elderly, frail population, didn't he? And many of them were quite ill, as she knew, because quite a lot of them, being on her books, died. I don't think there is, well, I'm sure, there is no doubt that Shipman murdered his patients. He took great care in doing so. He altered his records to make it look as if the cause of death that he had given was supported by what had happened in the patient's past. But very often it hadn't happened. He made it up and he inserted it. How did he get away with it? Well, no one could conceive of a GP doing this, despite John Rockinghams. It just was inconceivable. There were a number of people who were worried about the death rate in Shipman's patients in Hyde. There was the taxi driver who specialised in bringing old ladies to the surgery. And he would bring them, and he would bring them, and he would bring them, and suddenly he would stop bringing them because they were dead. There was the practice next door, or over the road, who were signing the cremation forms, the Part 3 cremation forms, or Form C as I think they were called then, who noticed that with a practice of 10,000 patients, they had done, I think it was 17 in one quarter of their own patients, but they've been asked to do 19 of Shipman's cremation forms, and his list was about a third of theirs. They were so worried that they approached the coroner, who, this was in early 98, in March. The coroner went to the police, and the police investigated. But they didn't want to investigate, they didn't want to go and arrest anyone or search anyone's house or anything like that, because Shipman was so well known in the community. He was a pillar of society. And they wanted to do this quietly. So a detective inspector got the job. He didn't know much about general practice. He didn't actually know anything about general practice, so he didn't know what he was looking for. And eventually the coroner was told, well, we can't find any evidence of any wrongdoing. So that was parked until Angela Woodruff came and said that she was concerned about the death of her mother. At which point the police said, oh, we investigated him for this sort of thing a few months ago. We didn't find anything. Well, have a look at the have a look at the will. As you can see, the press went to town on this. There's the will. It's obviously been bought from one of these bucket shop stationers who do will forms and divorce forms and all the other sorts of forms that you can get. It's typed on a pretty grotty typewriter. Actually, that typewriter was very old. As I said, 81-year-old Kathleen Grundy had trained as a secretary. She had had her own typewriter throughout her career. This was it. Shipman had borrowed it from her because he didn't have a typewriter in his computerized surgery. So he borrowed Kathleen Grundy's typewriter. He never actually returned it. It was found in his house when the police searched his house. And it's very easy to see that it was the same typewriter. It was very, very old. It had all sorts of problems. The letters were misaligned. It was the typewriter on which this will had been typed. Well, fair enough, it was Kathleen Grundy's typewriter. But she didn't have it at the time that it's dated. There are signatures. The signature of Kathleen Grundy at the bottom here, and masked now the signatures of the two witnesses. A handwriting expert was able to say that these were in fact copied. So the piece of paper that she had signed in the surgery, witnessed by the two witnesses who had been pointed out of the waiting room, Shipman had then spent quite a long time copying those signatures onto this form. Why he did this, no one knows. There are lots of theories, mostly around either he was now so confident and self-confident and had ideas of grandeur that he didn't think he'd get caught at all. The others that he was now one of those serial killers who'd got to the end and wanted to be caught. No one knows because he never said. So, eventually we wound up with this murder trial that was reported all over the world. Shipman remains, as far as we know, Britain's leading serial killer. And my concerns about the effect on general practice were right. There was an inquiry. It sat for 3 years. It cost £22.5 million. It looked at a total of 890 deaths. And it made a lot of recommendations. It said that Shipman couldn't have got away with this except for the fact that he could easily get hold of controlled drugs and there needed to be changes in the use of controlled drugs in the community. Shipman couldn't have got away with this if there had been proper death certification, if there had needed to be confirmation of the death by someone else other than the doctor certifying, and that for cremation it wasn't good enough just to go and tell someone what had happened and get them to sign that they believed you. There was the question of should the GMC have stopped him practicing when he developed a caffeine habit of 700 to 800 milligrams a day? And was the GMC just an old boys club that looked after the interests of doctors and did it need reforming? And there was the question of who actually keeps an eye on doctors, especially GPs, especially the ones that practice on their own. How do we know that they're good doctors? We need to, it isn't good enough for them just to qualify at the beginning of their career and then sail through until the end of their career without anyone looking at what they're doing. Hence, revalidation. For all of us, not just the GPs. Those were the major points that came up from the Shipman inquiry. The government was a little astounded by some of these recommendations. It took them 3 years to implement the recommendations on the use of controlled drugs in the community. The Department of Health did what it's best at doing, it set up a working party, which I sat on. There were those who said, well, no one should ever prescribe controlled drugs to any patient unless there are 2 doctors present who agree that this patient needs these drugs. That would have been a disaster for people who were dying in pain. That was successfully beaten back. The death certification one is very interesting. It was well known at the time that death certifications legislation was out of date. It was based on the 19th century Acts of Parliament. The BMA had been calling for reform since 1921. There had been about 4 reviews of the death certification legislation over the period, all of which had suggested that there should be reforms. One was huge, it was published just before the Shipman scandal broke, called the Fundamental Review of Death Certification, and it came out with pretty much the same recommendations that Dame Janet made in the inquiry. That was 2003, 2004. The Coroner's Act, which included death certification, was passed in 2010, but its implementation was delayed by the incoming government in 2010. There have been some changes now to cremation forms, but the big changes, although they're present in the legislation, have not yet been introduced. They probably will be in the next few months, and this is the medical examiner system. So every day, in hospital, in the community, the doctor will still have to, the attending doctor will still have to write a medical certificate of cause of death, but he will then have to take that to a medical examiner who will look through the notes, talk to the doctor, talk to anyone else involved, talk to the relatives, and decide whether or not he thinks that the cause of death as given on the MCCD is correct. Probably quite a good idea. There are probably a few deaths that slip through from time to time that are unnatural. There were a lot that slipped through with Shipman, but I don't think we're seeing anything like that number nowadays. It's probably a good idea, but I do wonder where we're going to get these medical examiners from. And I do wonder how long it's going to take to do all this work. It is said by the Home Office, who run death certification and cremation, that there will be a fast track for those faiths that need to bury their dead before sunset the next day. I don't actually see it happening, but we shall see. Maybe the Home Office knows something I don't. So yes, there have been quite a number of changes arising from Shipman and the Shipman inquiry. It took 12 years out of my life, with the investigation, trial, the inquiry, and the various working parties afterwards. In fact, I'm still doing it, aren't I? Here I am today. Having done the Shipman case, I then became, as far as I'm aware, the only GP on the police national computer as a GP expert. Lawyers know about experts. Experts are right at the top of their field. They are specialists. Now, my definition of a specialist is someone who knows almost everything there is to know about not very much. And my definition of a generalist, a GP, is someone who knows almost nothing about nearly everything. Some lawyers have found it quite difficult to use someone who knows not very much about nearly everything as an expert, but they have come to learn that it is useful. What should GPs do? What can be expected of GPs? And I've done a significant number of cases for various police forces, and eventually I was asked about Dr. Howard Martin. He was an elderly GP practicing in County Durham. He was tried for the murder of 3 of his patients. He was acquitted, so slightly different from Shipman. Harry Gittins was an elderly gentleman with carcinoma of the lower end of the esophagus. He underwent chemotherapy and radiotherapy. He was quite frail, but he was expected to live a little longer in reasonable comfort. However, he did develop discomfort after a discharge from hospital. He was seen by several of the doctors in the practice, and then eventually he was seen by Howard Martin. 3 times on the 21st of January 2004. At 8:45 in the morning, he was given morphine, 60 milligrams IM, and chlorpromazine, 100 milligrams IM. He had previously been on MST, that's slow-release morphine orally, 30 milligrams twice a day. So the jump from 30 milligrams twice a day orally to 60 milligrams intramuscularly was, if you look at the BNF and the guidance that it and other sources give on conversion from oral to parenteral medication, you will find that that's a bit above the top end of the range that the BNF would suggest. So he was given that at 8:45. Shipman did say to him, this will make you sleepy, and I think you ought to go and empty your bladder before I give it to you. Not Shipman, sorry, Martin. He came back at 6 o'clock in the evening. He was another of these old-fashioned doctors who would do it all himself. So he came back at 6 o'clock in the evening. Now, at 6 o'clock in the evening, Mr. Gittins remained very, very drowsy. In fact, he was barely rousable. In order to get a response out of him, Martin had to apply a painful stimulus, pressure on the supraorbital nerve, to get any reaction out of him at all. Nevertheless, Martin told Mrs. Gittins that Harry must still be in pain, and gave him another 100 milligrams of morphine. No, this time it was diamorphine, 100 milligrams of diamorphine, which is milligram per milligram twice as strong as morphine, intramuscularly, plus another 100 milligrams of chlorpromazine. Well, actually, big, hefty rugby players who go psychotic and needed restraining in the days when we used chlorpromazine for this, got about 25 milligrams. Harry Gittins remained asleep, and Howard Martin, being the very good doctor that he is, came back at 20 to midnight to see how his patient was getting on. Mrs. Gittins was quite pleased with her about this. She was getting very good, her husband was getting very good care. He hadn't woken up. He did get another 100 milligrams of diamorphine intramuscularly, together with another 100 milligrams of chlorpromazine intramuscularly. He died in the early hours of the morning. Frank Moss had carcinoma of the lung with cerebral secondaries. He was discharged from hospital taking 60 milligrams of codeine phosphate 4 times a day and some paracetamol. This made him a bit drowsy, so the dose of the codeine phosphate was reduced to 60 milligrams 3 times a day. He was visited by Howard Martin on the 13th of March 03. There were 4 or 5 visits on that day from Martin. The reason we're not quite sure is because he was running a dual, he was also running a dual note system, partly on handwritten and partly on the computer. He didn't actually enter anything on his computer at all. He couldn't. He took his handwritten notes back to the surgery and a clerk entered them. However, there were 4 or 5, and the notes were dreadful. Didn't really say anything very much, but what we do know is that he prescribed and picked up from the pharmacy 3 60 milligram ampoules of morphine that day for Frank Moss. Now in the morning Frank Moss was quite pleased because he knew he was ill, he knew he had a problem, and he had just had a proper hospital bed delivered, and he was going to be able to lift it up and sit up and lie down and so on. He wasn't actually, he was one of life's fiddlers. His daughter saw him in the morning, just taking the plug apart to make sure that it had been properly wired, and putting it back together again. Howard Martin decided that he needed to be transferred from his oral codeine phosphate to parenteral heavy-duty opiates. Fair enough, he may have been having difficulty swallowing tablets, we're not sure. The BNF, if you follow the guidelines, would suggest that you might start with a dose of 2.5 to 5 milligrams of morphine in someone who's been taking 180 milligrams of codeine phosphate a day. You might well have to titrate that up in small steps until such time as you have found the dose that helps your patient. But as I say, you start with 2.5 or 5 milligrams. Well, it appears that Howard Martin started with 60 and repeated it twice, or alternatively gave him 180 in one go. Mr. Moss died that night. Stanley Weldon had Alzheimer's disease quite severely. He was in a nursing home, he needed full-time nursing. He was unable to speak or communicate. He had not taken any opiates. He had in the past been prescribed buprenorphine patches, but he stopped needing those. So for the last 3 months of his life he took no opiates at all. In the last week or so of his life he developed a chest infection. He was seen by another doctor. His relatives were spoken to, and it was decided that there was no point in subjecting him to trying to swallow antibiotics. He was at the end of his life. He was demented. He couldn't make a decision for himself. His family, the doctor, and the nursing home staff decided that it was in his best interests not to treat this chest infection and see how it went. This was before the 2005 Mental Capacity Act. All these conversations would have to be recorded nowadays. Some of them were. The nursing home were quite good at recording conversations. Howard Martin was terrible at recording these sorts of conversations, which he said he'd had with all his patients. He was visited about 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the 18th of March by Howard Martin because he'd had a terrible night. He had got better from his original chest infection. He was doing quite well. The nursing notes show that he was reasonably comfortable in the 5 days in between. But the night of the 17th of March, he took a turn for the worse. He was coughing badly, he was bringing up sputum, he was somewhat restless. Howard Martin saw him and diagnosed a cerebral infarction. He gave him morphine, 60 milligrams IM. As I say, he'd had no opiates for the last 3 months. In effect, he was opiate naive. So he got 60 milligrams of morphine intramuscularly and died 2 hours later. It was quite clear that he was going to die within the next day or two anyway. The question is whether this 60 milligrams of morphine IM in a man who was very frail, who had a chest infection and respiratory distress, whether the morphine hastened his death, which is of course murder, if it's intended to hasten death. I do have to say that there was quite a long discussion in the Shipman trial about the dual effect of opiates, which for the non-medics among us, if you give opiates for pain, you need to give enough to make the patient comfortable about their pain. But they have side effects, various side effects, the main one of which is respiratory depression. And it is possible that a patient may be in such pain that he or she needs so much morphine, or opiate rather, so much opiate, that they do get respiratory depression, and this may hasten their death. But if you have given it for the pain, and you have titrated it properly, and as a result, the patient develops respiratory depression and dies, it's the dual effect of morphine. It is well known in the palliative world, it's actually quite well known now in the legal world, and you are unlikely to be charged with murder if you've done it, if it has happened, and you can show that you've done it properly, you've calculated the doses properly, you were aiming to relieve the patient's pain. Anyway, the jury were not convinced about Howard Martin and that he had intended to kill them. They were convinced that there was an element of doubt, and that's all you need, that he might have been, as an eminent oncologist from London said, just an old-fashioned doctor who hadn't kept himself up to date and who gave a little bit too much opiate. So he was acquitted of these 3 murders. Interestingly, the local coroner did hold an inquest on a 4th case, which the CPS had declined to take, and returned the verdict of unlawful killing. That was about Shipman and his ethylene addiction. Again, the press were quite interested in that. And there is a story about Shipman's ethylene addiction. The BMA, by mistake, sent out a press release telling everyone about it in the middle of the trial. The judge went ballistic. It could have brought the whole trial grinding to a halt. As I've said, the Shipman inquiry made a number of recommendations, many of which were on the stocks anyway. Appraisal and revalidation have been talked about for a couple of years. Colleges were pushing for it at that time. The Shipman inquiry just gave it a bit of a boost. It still took another year or two to be introduced. The Department of Health moves very, very slowly. So, Howard Martin, a couple of years later, did an interview with the Daily Telegraph. I helped patients die, says murder case GP. He admitted that his aim was to allow patients who were in the last stages of their lives to die peacefully. He said that he had talked to all his patients about this, and there are several patients who, where the cases were investigated, where the family were quite clear that yes, their relative had been in pain and suffering, and Howard Martin was the best doctor in the world. He because he helped their relative to die peacefully. We don't know whether Martin spoke to any of the 3 patients that he was acquitted of murdering about their wishes at the end of their lives. If he did, he didn't record it. But he was quite clear in these interviews that he had taken steps to hasten the death of various patients at the end of their life. Harry Gittins, the first one, he and his wife had actually booked a cruise later in the year. It wasn't that close to the end of his life. Although he would have died of this carcinoma of the esophagus eventually. And this really leads us on, I think, to the question of assisted suicide, assisted death. We clearly have at least one doctor, if not more, and there probably are more, who do believe it, along with now, the polls tell us, a majority of the country. We still have an awful lot of people who find this distasteful, unethical, against their religion, and absolutely to be abhorred. I don't have a particular opinion personally, but what I would say is that if the legalised assisted dying bill had been passed, then people like Martin would have no excuse to do what they do without talking about it, without making records about it, without involving the district nursing service. Harry Gittins spent nearly 24 hours lying in one position on his bed. Mrs. Gittins had no idea how to nurse him, and the district nursing service were not involved. He probably had pressure sores, but no one knew about it. Martin had been investigated some 10 years earlier for his haphazard approach to end-of-life care. He had been told that he needed to learn more about end-of-life care. He went on a course to learn about end-of-life care. Clearly didn't apply it. He went on doing what he had been doing. He was tried for murder. Okay, the jury acquitted him. Would they acquit him now, I wonder? The mood in the country has changed. We actually need clarity in the law. Yes, we've got clarity in the law. If you hasten someone's death, it's murder. We only have one grave of murder in this country, and you get life imprisonment for it. Do we need, in the 21st century, with the advances that we have made, do we need a little more subtlety in what we do and how we manage the end of life? The argument is, of course, that what we need to do is to invest an enormous amount of money and research into palliative care so that no one suffers at the end of their life. Absolutely. I'm not sure that actually we're going to be able to achieve that. That I think there will be patients who will suffer at the end of their lives if, no matter how good we are at our palliative care. As I say, I don't express an opinion. I merely ask the questions. And I think I'll ask you to ask the questions.
Any questions from the floor? Do we have anything to speak about?
If Shipman had been subjected to the current appraisal and revalidation procedure, would he have passed with flying colours?
I don't know about flying colours. He would have passed. He wasn't stupid. He was somewhat in advance of his time in terms of treating hypertension. He was in advance of his time in mental health issues. A little anecdote here. He was so in advance of his time in looking after mental health issues that when he was secretary of his LMC, He was instrumental in setting up a scheme locally in Hyde to help people with mental health problems. The ITV actually interviewed him about it at the time. This is back in the 80s. He was killing at the time, but no one knew. He was interviewed by the ITV. After the trial, the ITV actually found this interview in their archives. And they came to me and they said, would I like to comment on this? I said, well, yes, it was an advance of its time in mental health. Can we interview you saying that? Yes, you can. So they came along and the cameraman sat in the corner of my consulting room on the floor, cross-legged, with his camera at a terrible angle, pointing up at me sitting at my desk. This guy's an artist. What actually it turned out when they showed this on the Trevor McDonald show was that for whatever reason the cameraman in the original interview with Shipman had filmed it from this low angle. So they wanted to film me from the same angle. So after Shipman had done his bit, they faded my face onto his. I don't have a beard, but my glasses at the time were exactly the same shape as Shipman's. It was unnerving. He would probably have got away. He would have had a number of things that he had to do on his PDP, but no, I don't think an appraiser would have said, this guy's a murderer.
You shared that will extract that one of the patients had supposedly left to Dr. Shipman. Was that the only patient that had left him anything in his will, or was there multiple patients where that had occurred?
The feeling is that, I should have said, when the will was posted to the solicitors in Hyde, there was a letter with it which said, here's my will. And then there was a letter later saying, this patient has died. They were all typed on the same typewriter, which was in Shipman's possession at the time. J. or S. Smith was never identified. He or she described him or herself as a friend of Kathleen Grundy. No one knew a friend of Kathleen Grundy called J. or S. Smith. It is thought that Shipman, having forged the will one day, having killed it the next day, and wrote to the solicitors the next day to say, oi, there's this will, and I benefit from it.
There's increasing scrutiny in terms of auditing medical practice. I think in the Shipman case, one of the local undertakers had raised concerns because of the number of deaths that occurred in his practice, and had been to see either the coroner or the police or something about that. Is there a mechanism that's going to be in place to audit death rates in centres such as hospitals? Well, there is already in hospitals, but in general practice. Because if his death rate was 3 times, looking at the figures you quoted early on, his neighbouring practice was signing the cremation forms. That surely must be an outlier. If you're using statistics now looking at outlying practice, and certainly is a flag for something going on, not necessarily accusing somebody of murder, but certainly for looking at that, and why, can you explain the high death rate in your practice?
Yeah. The first thing to say is that Shipman's crude death rate was the 5th highest in Greater Manchester. It wasn't the highest. The other practices have been investigated. Yes, they have produced explanations. There have been rational explanations. I was asked some years later to investigate a series of deaths certified by a particular doctor. No one had actually bothered to find out that this doctor was the part-time medical assistant at a hospice. Statistics don't always tell you the truth. In Derby, the DRI was hammered by the Department of Health some years ago for having a terrible death rate post-surgery. The problem was that their hospice came under their auspices with the statistical analysis, and they had a coding clerk who, in the hospice, who coded catheterization as a surgical intervention. So all these people were catheterized just before they died. The Shipman inquiry spent nearly a week looking at the statistics of death rates. The expert evidence was given by Professor Paul Ayling then of Imperial College, now of the National Statistics Office, and Mohammed of Birmingham University, who also specialises in this sort of field. Even Dame Janet could not bring herself to make a recommendation that comparison of death rates could be done in such a way that it would be sufficient to identify this sort of thing going on. So it hasn't happened. It is incredibly difficult. There are so many random factors and there are so many systemic factors. What I do have quite a lot of experience of now is being called in by people who have noticed high death rates, and you go in and you say, here's an explanation for it. Okay, they say, but what if you're wrong? I'm going to get the blame if this turns out to be the next Shipman. So dig deeper, please. And actually, they don't know when to stop digging. So it isn't the simple instrument that everybody thought it was going to be. We may find that with the medical examiner system, the statistics will begin to improve and may become more helpful. The medical examiners themselves are supposed to pick up these things anyway. It's the biggest thing that will stop the next Shipman is the fact that people can now conceive of Shipman and people like him. People who have mild suspicions will raise them, like the undertaker, like the GP in the neighbouring practice, like the taxi driver. These suspicions will be raised and they will be investigated, and they will be investigated with a degree of expertise that the police did not have back in 1998. They didn't know. They have learned. I mean, they are actually quite good at spreading the message, and they will know how to investigate such things in the future.
Just ask, I read somewhere that there was a sort of hiatus in his behaviour that lasted several years. I don't know if that's true. And
there were 2 or 3.
Yeah, and whether that was ever explained. And the other thing is whether any of his family was there any evidence that they knew what happened?
First question first, there were 2 or 3 hiatuses. Usually after something had happened that had probably scared you. A relative had worried. And so it stopped for a while. He got over it. He persuaded the relative that they were worrying about nothing, but he stopped for a while. He stopped for 3 months after the March in police investigation, which he was not supposed to know about, but clearly he did. He stopped for 3 months, and he killed 3 more people, including Bianca Pomfret and Kathleen Grenville. So yeah, he had a certain sense of self-preservation up until he forged that will. The family are interesting. I don't think the children had any idea. His wife, Primrose, was present at one of the deaths. I think she must have known that there was something odd happening, but I don't think she could conceive of what was actually happening. All due respect to her, when she was still alive, she was not an intellectual giant. And I think she had a husband who was a well-known parochial of the town. She had her children to bring up. She lived in not necessarily the sort of comfort that many GPs' wives were living in those days. Shipman, though he had a large list, he didn't seem to be making an enormous amount of money. They lived fairly modestly. The house was a complete tip. The police took days to search it. They recovered 500 sets of notes, which should have been returned to the aerosol authorities. They recovered several thousand milligrams of morphine and diamorphine from the house, but it took some searching.
After he was convicted, did he ever admit that he had died?
No. He was, when when the inquiry started and looked at the Todmorden patients very early in his career, West Yorkshire Police came to interview him in prison. He turned to the wall and sat and said nothing for some considerable amount of time. He never spoke about it.
Two more questions.
It's a slight change of emphasis. Do you have a view about the patients who want to die? I'm thinking of the chronic neurological problems, and where at the moment they have to go to Switzerland in order to achieve their desired aims. So that will be different to the sort of patients who you've been talking about.
There are circumstances in which I would go to Switzerland, personally. I wouldn't do anything that was illegal in this country, and I wouldn't ask anyone to do anything illegal. I do hope that the fact that I have prepared an advance directive, and it's fairly detailed, will ensure that I don't suffer from a number of things that I might suffer from. There are ways of doing this, but at the end of the day, yeah, we need to be more subtle, as I said earlier.
One of the interesting things about Shipman is that he actually is a Nottingham boy. And he's a Nottingham Grammar School boy. And I met someone who actually went to school with him, and they thought he was a very ordinary fellow. You know, there's nothing... and I wonder, did he have a form of madness? Unfortunately, this area is also linked with Beverly Allett, who murdered children and babies in a hospital in Grenville, and was thought to have a personality disorder in the end. But what exactly do we think about the mental state of Shipman? And is there any lessons for the selection of medical students? He went to Leeds Medical School.
That's where he met Primrose. On the bus going into the medical school. Not at the medical school.
One of my former partners went to school with him, and the doctor whom I replaced when she retired was his, not prison visitor, but wrote to him while he was in prison. And both of them said he was entirely unexceptionable. He gave no hint or clue of any sort.
I would agree with that. Many people have written books about it, mostly forensic psychologists. They all have their own theories. None of them has written anything where I said, yes, that's the answer. We don't know. Mad or bad, what's the difference? We know that he was reasonably bright at school, but he wasn't top of the class. I think we know that he was a bit of a learner at school. He didn't have a wide circle of friends. And we know that his mother died a traumatic death of cancer in some pain at the age of 43 when he was a teenager. And his response to her death was to go out in the rain on a run around the neighbourhood, which lasted most of the night.
Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful talk. Just thinking about Howard Martin, I'm just looking that he qualified in 1957, and the prosecutions were brought against him in 2004, some 47 years into his career. And I just wonder if the audience would like to raise their hands if they're still in frontline practice 47 years after qualifying. So it's quite exceptional, isn't it, to still be in frontline practice?
Well, he had more or less retired by the time he was charged, but only just. Although he practiced in County Durham, he lived in Pressating in North Wales. He commuted weekly.
But the drift of practice over 47 years in the management, he was an army doctor for 18 years, and then the drift of practice and the change in methods is massive. I mean, I've been in practice since 77, and the way we manage paediatrics is entirely changed in the last 20 years. And so the rate of change for people who are working front line is massive, and the expectations are constantly changing. So
Absolutely, and we now have a clear professional duty to keep ourselves up to date.
yeah,
We didn't in those days, but as I say, Shipman did in a number of fields. I mean, I also I started general practice in the early 80s. The drug of choice for hypertension, if you treated it, because it wasn't regarded as necessarily needing to be treated, but if you did treat it, the drug of choice was guanethidine. We later moved on to methaldopa, which my boss, when I was a house physician, said was a very good drug for lowering blood pressure, but he would reserve it for use in traffic wardens because of its side effects.
Just give you a small token of I'd like to ask my colleagues.
Thank you very much.
Well, the public in this country have an overwhelming desire to involve themselves in the details of crime. And they only do this through television series and crime novels. And it's not entirely surprising that tonight, lawyers and doctors who share the same natural interests as the rest of the population have turned up in their numbers to hear you talk about this subject. I think perhaps the lawyers would possibly struggle a little more by the fact that the doctors are villains of the peace tonight. But enough said about that. I thought I knew quite a bit about Shipman, although I have to confess I knew nothing at all about Dr. Martin. But after listening to your excellent talk, I've come to realise that there's an awful lot I didn't know about Dr. Shipman, and I found out what you said about Dr. Martin to be exceedingly interesting. And I'm very grateful indeed, and I'm sure we all are here, very grateful indeed that you came and gave us this talk tonight. Thank you very much.
For a wonderful talk. Just give you the date of the next meeting, which is what's on my list, is the 18th of May, and it's the Rutland Ospreys Go Global. It's by Tim Mackerel, BSc, who is a senior reserve officer for the Leicestershire and Rutland Trust. At Rutland Water. He's also the founder of the Osprey Fireways Project. He's currently writing up his PhD on ospreys with the University of Leicester, and I've heard this talk, it's inspirational, it's very little to do with medicine, it's all about relaxing and enjoying yourself, and it should be a very good talk, so we look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you.